Eric, we're doing something different today.
Yeah, I mean, normally we talk over guests, but we thought maybe including them on the conversation would be a bold move forward for the podcast.
Yeah, they could be the fly on the wall and they could try and participate, but we'll exclude them just by our natural chemistry. So, of course, we're joined by who? It's obvious who it is. Eric, Dr. Connor Heffernan, back in the house. Here today
That's
to talk
right.
about what?
Oh man, we got the strength historian on. For those who don't remember, which is no one because you're all loyal listeners, we have had multiple conversations with the DPTist of DPTs. We've had Nick Licamelli on. We've had the Mr. Barbell Medicine himself on.
Yep.
That's an MD, folks. That's a real doctor. We've had Quinn Henoch, that sultry-voiced practitioner of the physical arts. But we've had a lot of these roundtables where we've discussed some of these, what I would describe as fragility narratives that have gone around in the lifting circle. Oh, hey, you don't want to do X, Y, or Z, or it'll X, Y, or Z, your X, Y, or Z.
Yep.
Basically all coming down to you don't want your knees to go over your toes. You don't want to squat deep, or maybe you don't want to squat shallow. Maybe you have to squat deep, or you don't want to deadlift with a round back. You should deadlift with a round back. You should wear a belt. You shouldn't wear a belt. No one knows what to do, right? And they all comes down to this idea that our body is easily broken, damaged, and it will, once you go to Snap City, you never leave. They just lock down the city and that's it. You know, it's permanent COVID time in Snap City. No one gets out. All right. So I think the thing that people might not know is, where did these narratives come from? And that is not the job of a DPT or an MD. So that's the unfortunate side of why we don't have the old crew on who has graced our podcast a number of times. But instead, we have a strength historian on who can help us understand the origin of some of these narratives.
Connor, thank you for being on.
Thank you for having me on. I'm just so excited to, I guess, peel back the layers or peel back the skin, really hash out some of these tricky components within this, chip in where I can, and then, I don't know, maybe suddenly make some, I don't know, just enlightened thoughts about all of these problems that we have. Just, you know, hash it out, get to the root of all of this, I think, is really what I'm going for in this.
Connor, can I just say that I think understanding the historical context as it relates to some of these narratives are very important, and that is why we wanted to include you. This is, and again, it's not because of anything that transpired in the past. This isn't an apology tour. In fact, we're proudly restating exactly who we are. So we're including you in the intro here. Speaking of narratives, I thought it would be very pertinent for us to bring up something that happened in the cult, and maybe you could help shed some light on this, because as we know, myself and Eric stand atop the pyramid, clasping hands, jointly united in terms of help lifters. That's it. That's the express purpose. But there was a review that we received recently that I do want to talking about historical context narratives, because we have the dominant narrative and the only true narrative, because it's a top-down hierarchy, is that we're the cult. We inform reality. But something came up. So let me just read you the review, and maybe you could provide a nuanced insight from a historical perspective as to what they're really trying to say, because maybe we're just not interpreting it correctly, because I know when it comes to primary sources, when you take a look at things, it's also the interpretation that matters. So, sorry, let me just bring up my phone here. So it goes...
I am very excited to hear this. Go ahead.
Thank you. Yeah. So it says...
Honestly, I think people have been starved for this type of content, Omar. I'd say it's been a veritable famine for people to really get Connor to get on here. And I think this is the mashup they've all been waiting for sure.
No, I thought the same thing.
Oh no, they're absolutely famished. So gents, it goes like this. Here's the review. It goes, Eric gently disrobes, emerging from the... Nope, okay, that's not... Nope, that's
fiction.
Wrong screenshot. Just, we could, Brandon, let's retake this. We'll erase 10 seconds back. Okay. So anyways, guys, here's the take. Here's the review. Here's the Apple review that we found. Cool. It goes, so where's the info? 1 out of 5 stars. It says...
Is that it?
No, it says, I'm going to try and get this out.
I wish that was it. Where's the info? 1 out of 5 stars.
So 1 out of 5 stars. Even at 2 times, it's not worth my time. What a couple of jokers with no real info. I wonder if Eric is going to mention again that he's a doctor. It's been about 45 seconds since the last time. And I just want to say, here's the correction, Connor. I'm the one that states that Eric's a doctor. I say Dr. Eric Helms, PhD. Eric has never mentioned his academic credentials, so he doesn't even get that right. But if you could just interpret that from a historical context, then we can move on when it comes to these dominant narratives in the fitness industry. I think it would allow the cult to tether it between the cult, their fitness journey, and everything in between.
Yeah, I mean, to start, I think maybe it may have been a bad attempt at like a tuberous or humorous joke on their part. You guys really are, pillars of the strength community.
Yep.
And I think just sometimes when you try and get to the root of people's jokes, it's just tricky. And I mean, things get mashed up. I mean, it can really make you boil sometimes, but it's the world that we live in. So I think the best thing is just to give yourself a little bit of legume or leg room, I suppose, and just tater forth.
I don't think I could have said that better myself, or butter myself. But ultimately, it's good that we bring these things to light, because these types of things and other things tend to really grow in the dark.
Yeah.
So if we don't bring them to light, they're going to grow. They're going to get huge. They might get tasty. But ultimately, we're not trying to bite into that type of controversy here on Iron Cult. So thank you, Omar, and thank you, Connor.
And I just want to say, we've been accused of, once again, silencing critics, that we only allow positive reviews on Iron Cult. Because, yes, we have like a 4.96 out of 5 on iTunes. If we just look from a probability standpoint, what does that mean, Eric? We're probably going to be reading a 5-star review. I had to go out of my... Eric, you know how far back I had to go to find this 1-star review?
1984.
2 weeks. It was so far back to be almost irrelevant. So this is just an indication that we show transparency here. And that's when it comes to these dominant narratives, I think what is important. And maybe to kick it off, Eric, can you set the scene of the slaughter for everyone that's listening? Just because we've heard these ideas, like the pain narratives we tell ourselves, and you did a fantastic job giving examples and counterexamples and what's been so common when it comes to the fitness space. But just from your perspective, what you've observed, set it up so then Connor can knock it out of the park.
Yeah, I think probably the one that people are most familiar with in modern days is the idea of squat depth and potential injury risk. I think I've literally heard both, that squatting too deep or too shallow is bad for your knees. And I'm sure that one of them was the first, and then the other one was just the pendulum shift and kind of the point counterpoint, good or bad way that humans react to all information. But Connor, I would love to hear, where did this start? Where did the idea, the deep squats, which, man, if anyone's ever seen a baby or any agricultural society or any natural state of humanity, you'd think really, squatting deep is bad for your knees? That's kind of seems like a normal thing. So anyway, I'll let you take it from there. And one thing I do want to say, actually, we need to give a shout out. For those who want to do a deep dive on these types of things and content, Connor has done a fantastic job with Arthur Lynch on the No Lift podcast. So I just want to give the No Lift podcast a shout out. They've covered this and a lot of other topics. So if you want even more information, if you're really a fan of this episode, highly recommend the No Lift podcast. But anyway, Connor, over to you, buddy. What's up with the squat depth in the knees, man?
There's a sweet spot in the squat, and if you go 1 inch above or 1 inch below, the knee joint will actually shoot out. And I've seen it happen, and it is utterly terrifying. And I mean, do it at your own risk. I have seen, so many injuries in my time. Also, be careful with the narrative of if anyone looks at a baby, because I don't know if y'all remember it was called the Third World Squat on T Nation. There was an article. And it was all about how you should just get into the deep squat during the day. And I remember there's a brief period where I'd subtly try and get into a deep squat position while waiting for the bus, until I realized that for people who aren't aware of what you're doing and trying to work on that flexibility, that it looks like you're trying to defecate on a bus stop. So to move into the danger side of the science around this, we are going to be going back to the 1950s, 1960s. This is it's not a time when people started to study exercise scientifically. We can go back to the 1700s, if not further back. But it is a time when the rudimentary field of exercise science, sports science, etc., is beginning to take hold. And there's an immediate disconnect in the 50s and 60s. And this is going to make me sound like an utter asshat, but there's a disconnect between people who lift and people who don't lift. I know
Oh,
how that sounds, but this is, this is feeding into the narratives, and the people who lift are producing quite good research. The people who maybe don't have that relationship with lifting are producing more questionable research. One of the people in the no lift camp, and this isn't the no lift podcast, this is the no lift camp.
this is the do you even lift? And the answer is no. Yeah.
Firmly
No,
no.
but
Yeah.
I study it.
That's so
And
funny.
I need to be careful because they say like those who can't do teach, those who can't teach phys ed. It's like I study the people who teach phys ed, so I'm really not sure where I am in that. So I'm not throwing shade at anyone intentionally because I'm aware of my own like precarious position. But in the Do You Even Lift Bro camp, before Do You Even Lift Bro became a thing, is an individual called Dr. Klein, who is I suppose, early forerunner of exercise science and sports science, who becomes very, very interested in studying knee health and in studying, in particular, the back squat and its effect on, I suppose, knee health. So in the late 1950s, early 1960s, he starts to put together a series of studies on heavy back squatting and the impact that that has on the knees. And interestingly, for Carl Klein and Dr. Terry Todd and Jan Todd and Jason Shirley have an excellent book called The History of Strength Coaching in America, which talks about this, and also on Iron Game history, just putting my shout outs there. But interestingly, Carl Klein, he actually takes about 160 weightlifters, very, very elite level weightlifters, many of whom compete in the 1959 Pan American Games. He also gets some college lifters and then some regional lifters as well. He puts them into a study and compares them with, inexperienced lifters or people who have no lifting experience whatsoever. And he starts to study the, I suppose, forces that are exerted on the knee joint when it comes to back squatting. And this will blow everyone's mind. He finds that back squats put a lot of force in and around the knee joint. Now, this, again, if anyone has ever squatted even without a weight, one would think would be fairly self-evident. But he starts to say, well, that this is damaging and this is dangerous. And although he's correct in asserting that force is being exerted to the knee joint, he does not say that this is a natural consequence of putting a heavy weight on one's back and squatting down. He says that this is something that over many years would denigrate the knees, would damage the knees, would hurt the knees. So deep squats are harmful. And he goes further on to the early 1960s where he's saying anything below a half knee bend is useless and ruinous. So he's saying don't even bother going below parallel because it's useless. It will harm you in untold ways. And what's so important about this is early on in this research, Carl Klein is published or Sports Illustrated published an article on Carl Klein. They effectively call him the man who saved American knees, which I don't know in what field that is like the superhero moniker one wants. I'm a pro wrestling fan, so like Dusty Rhodes, the man of the hour, the titan of power, always sweet and not sour. That's sort of the moniker I would I would like to be applied to myself. The saver of knees doesn't exactly have the same.
Did you say, Connor, the savior of American knees? What was the exact title that he was bestowed?
Oh, I'd have to find the actual article, but it is along the lines of like the man who saved, the American knee. Oh, sorry. So it's the title. I have it here in front of me. The knee is not for bending. Deep bends and duck waddles fell to a Texas professor's 20-year anti-squat crusade. So then they talk about him as, the man who's going to save the American knee, the man who has stopped Americans from getting into this horrible deep squat position. And he's spent 20 years of his life studying the knee. And, we cannot dispute the fact that his findings that a heavy squat will exert force on the knee problematic. The problem is what he, I suppose, concludes from that research. And what's interesting about Carl Klein is there's a disconnect, again, between the lifting community and the athletic community. So in the lifting community, Carl Klein becomes the straw man for any weightlifter writing about back squats. So John Grimmick, who we'll actually probably talk about again in a different context in terms of the muscle bound myth and the science around that. But John Grimmick is a Mr. America bodybuilding champion, very accomplished Olympic weightlifter. He's a very athletic individual. He's a writer for Strength and Health magazine, and he also becomes the editor for Strength and Health magazine in later years. In the 60s and 70s, he's saying, yeah, back squats exert force on the knee. Maybe that's a good thing. Maybe the muscles around the knee will get stronger. Maybe this isn't a problem. But in the general community, especially in the sporting and athletic community, the Sports Illustrated article kind of sums up the reaction to Karl Klein's conclusions, and that is don't back squat. Definitely don't do a deep, like do a deep squat. If you are going to do a squat, do parallel or actually slightly above parallel to save the knee. And then this will then feed into later studies which are going to be picked up into that, don't push the knee in front of the toes when back squatting. Always have the knee go into a very strict plane. So Karl Klein, although he is pilloried in the lifting community, very early on, Bill Starr, who I think, what's the name of his influential book? Only the Strong Survive, or something along those lines. He actually writes in a different publication about Klein's methodology, and he says that it's complete, like, hokum, hogwash, it's incredibly tenuous. He says that even the recording measurements that he used could be manipulated depending on who was administering the test. So think of like a knee brace. In my head, I'm just thinking of Stone Cold Steve Austin, with the knee braces around each leg. I like wrestling. It's okay. We're all friends. I can share that and not be embarrassed. But effectively, some of the researchers would press down on the knee brace during these experiments, which would then increase the pressure on the knee joint. Other researchers wouldn't. So you're getting this incredible noise in between the actual participants themselves. But that doesn't matter because it feeds into a narrative, especially in sporting communities, that weightlifting is dangerous. Because in the 50s and 60s, the idea of weight training a team doesn't really exist just yet. There's starting to be a paradigm shift, but there is a huge amount of suspicion that heavy weight training will make players slower, muscle bound, they'll lose their flexibility, they'll get injured, etc. So for that community, the sporting community, and the general public who are influenced by the sporting community, this is confirmation that heavyweight lifting is dreadful. In the lifting community, he's just like a figure of fun. Like Strength and Health magazine will spend the 1960s to the 1980s just continually ragging on Karl Klein. But it doesn't matter because it seems to give credence to this idea that squats are bad for the knees. And like as late as the 2000s, there's a great article from Charles Stanley in 2001 in which he's complaining that the general public still thinks squats are bad for your knees. Like it is something that again and again and again starts to be replicated, not through the exercise science community, but through the general public. And I think that's part of a broader, I suppose, conversation about where people get information.
Dude, there's so many interesting threads that come out of this era where that you can see the narratives are still carried on today. Beyond just the squats are bad for the knees. Like the first one I think of is the stereotypical lab coat who doesn't lift telling me what I should do. What do you lab coats know? Obviously I've been, I've actually found myself on both sides of that conversation at different points in the last decade, on like the forums and stuff like that, being either accused of being a meathead who doesn't know anything, or of course the lab coat, which is interesting. And you can see that those riffs, they don't come out of nowhere. Like there was literally a point where someone with a lab coat who didn't lift was doing poor research and decade-long lasting harm to the lifting community, And then there's the narrative that I used in the introduction when we were talking about this whole podcast of the idea that essentially we're fragile, that instead of being these adaptive organic structures, we're actually kind of like a car, and if you don't, like anytime you do something, the gears are grinding on each other and you just got a limited number of contractions. Like the idea that if we're putting stress on a joint, it's only going to get worse. Not the idea, that we could put stress on a joint, then if it's not overcoming its tolerance at the time, it can adapt, and then you can keep progressing that overload over time and get even stronger knee joints. So I think like that's a lot of narratives that are going on at the same time. And it makes me see that, the rift between science and practice has some understandable roots. It's not just like science denialism or anti-intellectualism or anything like that. There are not that many generations ago where scientists weren't necessarily always helping lifters do better. And sometimes we're just kind of denigrating everything they did. So I just think that's really interesting.
Yeah, and Dr. Eric Helms, I think that's an excellent point. And I mean, to hear that from a doctor is actually quite refreshing, Dr. Eric Helms. And one of the reasons for that discrepancy, Doctor, as I'm sure you're aware,
Mm.
is just the lack of good research that's actually published around the time of Karl Klein. So
Yeah.
there's an excellent article recently published by James Nuzzo, about the history of strength training research in man. So he effectively looked at what was published in 1894. Let's run that timeline all the way up to 1979 and see what studies were published, when, where, and what were they looking at. So he says, like, there's research being published in the 1890s that could be classed as strength training research, but there's a huge gap from the early 1900s to kind of the early 1940s in the kind of research that's being done in the realm of health and fitness. And the reason for that is there's a huge emphasis on cardiovascular fitness in that intervening period. So Peter Karpovic, who's another individual who I'm sure we'll be talking about in a minute, but he is a convert to the idea that strength training is good. But he's talked about, and his students talked about the fact that when he said he wanted to study strength training in individuals in the 40s and 50s, he was met with the idea of, like, why would you do that? Why would you bother with that? Cardiovascular training, that's where it's at. That's what we need to look at. And James Nuzzo's article actually bears that out, where you can see, like, oh wow, there's a huge gap, in the literature here. And then you can see the allure of someone like Karl Klein. He's at University of Texas. I'm not just saying that's a big university, for that time, because I was there for 2 years. But he's coming out. He's 20 years of research behind it. He's saying, I examined Pan-American lifters. I looked at some of the strongest men that America has to offer, and this is what I found. And you can see that in the absence of, like, decades of other research, that there would be an appeal to that, because strength training, and I'm sure this isn't news to anyone, like, it's weird. Like, I love it, but it's very strange. And, like, we have to understand that this thing that we love has its origins in the circus and in people in music hall and vaudeville theaters, like that, in the modern sense, or in the military. So, like, it's in subcultures the whole way through. So it's always been a subculture, but especially in that time. So there's a suspicion around it anyway, and we'll go into that a little bit more. But there's also just no solid ground. So Karl Klein is helping to create a foundation with something that, if you don't lift, like, if you're part of that group that says cardiovascular is all that we need to look at, and you're suspicious of weight training anyway, it's like, okay, like, he's doing this research. Yeah, that seems to make sense. We all know it's bad anyway. So, I mean, like, fire away. So yeah, I think, to go back to your point, Doctor, the suspicion is, I suppose, fueled in part by a societal suspicion around it, but also by the fact that, like, there's nothing good to compare it to, which, as someone who has to go through very rigorous peer review, which is super mean on more than one occasion, I would love the idea of there being nothing that I can just publish whatever I want, which I realize is just Twitter and Instagram. But I think you get my point.
Yeah, no, I think it's a tale of how, when we have an inherent bias, it can very easily change the standards we use for the evidence we're presented, right? So we've got arguably a lot longer history of higher quality research being done in parallel fields to strength training research, cardiovascular health, and even endurance training. That's a much more well-established sector of research for a long time. And part of being an established sector of research is that the methodologies used are typically more rigorous, standardized, and you can find more reliable results that are likely to be properly interpreted. So when we break down this study, it has some pros, I'm not going to lie. I have never done a study where I've collected data on over 100 elite level weightlifters. I've done some research on like 5 elite level weightlifters. Numerous times. I've got some, like, even some double digit crossovers where we got some good athletes in there, but it is nigh impossible these days to even do a cross-sectional analysis of that many people. So kudos in that sense. And that's another thing I want to point out. This is a cross-sectional analysis of a purportedly mechanistic outcome. So, like, let's think of some parallels today. If we did a cross-sectional analysis comparing lifters to non-lifters on EMG, I wouldn't jump on this podcast and go, hey, this means this is going to happen long term, because we know, okay, we're looking at a snapshot of a finding that is supposed to represent something that we hope happens long term. And I would need to do some more work to really convince you that those findings were relevant for a long term. I need to, hey, look, check this study out where they looked at the acute changes in EMG and how that related to, changes in strength or changes in hypertrophy, because ultimately that's what we care about. So the parallel to what was done by Klein, he would need to show, hey, I got this brace, and it measures forces on the knee. And when I measure it and someone else measures it, here's the reliability between us. We have the inter-rater reliability data. Oh, and by the way, we took a 20-year prospective cohort of a couple hundred people, and we measured knee forces at various points at pre, mid, and post, right? And we then created associations with injury rates. And we say, hey, guess what? This is predictive of injury rates. So now we know that if Tom, my research assistant, measures it, or Mary, or me, we get a similar rating, and it seems correlated long-term with knee health, and now we did this study, then it would be fine. But none of that was done. It's not related to anything. We don't know the reliability between people. It's just simply, hey, we got a measure, and it's different between these groups, and we're just going to assume it's bad. And interestingly enough, the scientific community looks at that and goes, yeah, checks out. Despite the fact that they use much more sound methods in other areas and sectors of research. So anyway, going back to my original point, you've got these other researchers and scientists who are looking less critically at this study on knee forces and health and squats than weightlifters with no scientific training. Now, of course, the weightlifters have a bias that squats are probably good, but the interesting thing is now they're being more critical of something that is not confirming their biases. And it's not that biases can never be removed. We're going to have them, but we need to be aware of that. And that's why we have certain scientific standards. Like if we can't, if we throw out the hierarchy of evidence or sound methodology when we come across something that seems to, that checks out, I'm good with it. That anecdote might as well be a meta-analysis. And that's an issue. And I think we're actually seeing that a little bit in the root of this conversation.
Connor, a practical question here. I feel like Derek Smalls from Spinal Tap. Are we still going to do Stonehenge? Just with Karl Klein, what kind of blew my mind when he did the studies, okay, you got these elite level lifters. So think about what Eric just said. He has access to these 159 lifters. He's going to do this analysis. He's going to measure the force. Cool. But just talking about potentially, I don't know, bias, or maybe there's something catastrophic he witnessed in one of the lifters. Wouldn't you talk to some of the lifters that have been doing this for a while, or the gyms that they go to, and say hey, seems like there's a lot of force. I'm making this up, you're all between 20 and 30, but there's probably people in their 40s or that are in the gym culture that have been doing squats for 20, 30 years. Extra force is being exerted here on the knee joint. I wonder, it seems like this could be bad. Well, let me just ask out of curiosity, just to see if there could be something there to the 40-year-old or 50-year-olds, because he basically has the best of the best lifting at the highest level, and he could just ask these questions. So I'm just wondering, was there potentially something catastrophic where someone was warming up and maybe it was just this scene that happened for him where someone dropped the bar and he's just oh, this is fucking terrible for your knees, you know what I mean? Where you just that it's so tenuous, it seems, the conclusion after having access. Think about how many research don't have access to such a, not that you need such a high level, but I mean really these are really good specimens for this study, even just to qualitatively ask questions.
Well, I mean, bear in mind that he did this research within the same 10-year period that Peter Karpovic did an IQ test with lifters to dispel the rumor that lifters were dumb meatheads. So this is
right.
This is very much the scientific opinion of the lifting community. And actually, no, but it's a good point, because you'd think hey, I mean, I'm dealing with Bob Hoffman's lifters. Bob Hoffman of York Barbell, also the US Olympic weightlifting coach. At that time, he's really trying to get scientific approval for weightlifting in America, and we'll talk about when that is successful. Karl Klein has access to his lifters, would very easily have access to Bob Hoffman. He doesn't seem to have, I suppose, watered down his opinion too much. And again, the Bill Starr quote that I mentioned, he says that he was a subject of Karl Klein on multiple occasions, and there was never any attempt to, quote, weigh out Klein's bias or prejudices involved in these experiments. Yep. And the thing, when I go back to that original quote, which I mentioned, where Klein said that anything below a half knee bend is useless and ruinous, that was him stepping down from the hill, because initially it was all squatting is terrible and awful for you. So his halfway point was a half knee bend or a half squat. So there doesn't seem to have been that interest. And it is that thing of when you have a hammer, everything looks like a nail. And I suppose now is a good time to show actually how ignorant the scientific community was of lifting, and to pivot into Peter Karpovic and Bob Hoffman, who I've mentioned a little bit, because to me this is one of the most heartwarming, upsetting, confusing anecdotes from the lifting community's interactions with the scientific community in the 40s. So to set the scene, there is a wee lad at Springfield University, pardon me, who is a lifter and a gymnast called, I want to find his name here, it's Frank Fraser or something wonderfully alliterative along those lines, but Fraser, who I know that is certainly part of his name, Fraser Ferguson. How did I get that wrong? Go back 2 seconds. Fraser Ferguson, an outstanding weightlifter and gymnast. He is a student at Springfield College. One of his professors is Peter Karpovic, who is originally born in Russia, moved to the United States, and will teach at Springfield College for several decades. And he is continually butting heads with his professor, Dr. Karpovic, much like Dr. Helms. They're both doctors, and and Dr. Karpovic is fundamentally of the opinion that lifting weights causes people to become muscle-bound, slow, inflexible, and clumsy. Fraser Ferguson, as a weightlifter and gymnast, someone with a little bit of experience, says, this kind of smells like BS to me. But Karpovic is a man of science, and he's saying, no, this is ridiculous, and I can tell you why, X, Y, and Z. So Ferguson does one of the best FUs I think one could ever do to a professor. He manages to get Bob Hoffman, John Grimmick, and John Davis to visit Springfield College and give a demonstration to Karpovic, his class, his cohort, etc. And for people who aren't in the know, as I said, John Grimmick is a Mr. America bodybuilding champion. He's a fantastic Olympic weightlifter. John Davis is one of the greatest weightlifters that America has ever produced, including the present generation. He is a wonderfully world-renowned international Olympic weightlifter. So you have two very accomplished weightlifters coming to Springfield College. And I want to read out the transcript of what happened between Dr. Karpovic and these lifters. Because again, bear in mind, this is the equivalent of me now meeting, say, Hafthor Bjornsson, looking up and kind of straining my neck and saying, can you tie your shoes? So I'll put on my BBC voice. Will you please ask Mr. Grimmick to scratch his back between the shoulder blades? There was silence. Hoffman looked at Grimmick. Grimmick looked at Hoffman. Then they and everybody else looked at me. This is Fraser Ferguson. So this is kind of like, Dad, you're embarrassing me in front of my friends. Said Hoffman, and why do you want Grimmick to scratch his back? Because I've been told that weightlifters are so muscle-bound that they cannot scratch their backs. Quick aside, Grimmick could do the splits. Well, John, said Hoffman, addressing Grimmick, oblige the doctor and scratch your back. And Grimmick did, first with one hand and then the other. He scratched from above the shoulder and then from below. Davis did the same. The audience roared with laughter. Both men had huge muscles and therefore should have been muscle-bound. This is Karpovic's reminiscences. But they were like bumblebees who fly. Again, this idea of we don't know how a bumblebee could possibly fly. How could a weightlifter scratch his own back? And it continues on in that vein. So, that's the early 1940s. Like that is the level that we're going at, that you could see an elite champion weightlifter and bodybuilder and be like, can you scratch your shoulders? Now, admittedly, in the current age of mass monsters, that is actually a legitimate concern, and there are anecdotes of people struggling to clean themselves after they go to the bathroom, but let's save that for a different podcast. But in that time, to meet two of the greatest weightlifters of the generation and be like, yeah, you can't scratch your back, though. I mean, come on.
I love it. The idea that you don't have enough shoulder flexion to scratch your back. Anyway, go ahead and do a clean and jerk.
From above and below, guys. Yeah. Scratch his back from above and below. I mean, it was staggering. But to Karpovic's credit, he gets laughed at by his own students, which, it happens to me on a regular basis. But I'm sure if you were respected by your students, that would actually be quite a stinging and hurtful thing, rather than just desperately seeking their approval. But Karpovic listens to the laughter. He sees what's in front of him. He kind of pokes and prods John Grimmick, and then eventually he sees John Grimmick and Davis do clean and jerks and snatches and says, there might actually be some athleticism to this. And he'll spend the next decade, the 1940s and 50s, doing actually quite good research on very annoying things. And I say very annoying things because they're things that there are studies that are downright insulting for the lifting community. So one of the things he tests, as I already mentioned, is whether or not lifters are dumber than the general public. So he actually administers IQ tests to college men who lift and compares them to the IQs of people who don't lift. And he has an entire gradient for it. So, A is like top of the pops, B is middle of the road, C, we're starting to get worried, D, we're not going to talk about that, etc. Lifters score a B plus, which is better than the average. So we're not dumber, we're not the smartest, but we're nearly there, which I think is, probably where the root of happiness lies. He also does research on whether or not lifting makes you injury prone. And this is something that Karl Klein could and should have done in his own studies. So by this point, Karpovic is part of the Bob Hoffman crew. I don't mean that in a supplement company pays a researcher to say this is the best thing in the world. But I mean, Hoffman gives Karpovic access to his magazines, his lifting community, etc. So does Perry Rader of Ironman magazine. So Karpovic does a very simple thing. I assume that weightlifting is dangerous. I'm going to ask weightlifters, you just list down all the injuries you've had, over the last 5 to 10 years, etc., whatever the time frame was. He puts this survey in Strength and Health, in Ironman. He gets 31,702 responses, and the incidence of injuries was 1.5%. And most of the injuries consisted of minor injuries of, quote, pulled muscles and tendons. The incidence of hernias was 20 times less than the selection of the average public that he had found. So he has access to, and we can talk about, the dangers of asking people and blah, blah, blah. But he has access, and that's going back to your point, Omar, of like, wouldn't you have asked people? It's like, well, 31,000 men were, and this isn't like the collectivism of today, like, will you please do this survey that I'm doing for my university? And we kind of ignore every 10 and then maybe do one. Like this is, you had to fill out the form, you had to put it in an envelope, you had to send it off, like it required a little bit of motivation to do it. And again, we can see that as a potential problem, that only the people who weren't injured and were motivated did it, yada, yada, yada. But it shows that there are some within the scientific community who are trying to eke out whether or not lifting is safe. And there are flaws in the ways that they're doing it. There are insulting undertones to the ways that they're doing certain things, but they're trying to do better. And on the last point on Karpovic, he also tests whether or not lifters are slower than the general public. And I don't mean, we've already talked about the IQ test, I mean physically slower than the general public. So he gets like a hand crank, like the hand treadmills. He effectively gets one of them and he gets the lifters to compete against the general public, or he measures the lifters against the general public. It wasn't like a game show where he had them like furiously pumping the hand treadmill. And again, he finds that the lifters are faster on average than the general public. So around the same time that Karl Klein is saying like these squats are bad, they're going to hurt you, they're going to harm you, you have someone else in the scientific community who's saying, okay, we all think lifters are dumb. And I mean, anecdotally, we've all had that confirmed to us at various points in our lives. But, in the round, the idea that they're dumb isn't actually true. In the round, the idea that they're muscle bound isn't actually true. In the round, that weightlifting is dangerous or it's going to make you injured, that's not necessarily true. But the fact that those studies need to be done shows us the very low base of knowledge that we have. And again, we will have the same concerns brought up in different realms and different periods. So the moral panic around children lifting weights or adolescents lifting weights, studies will need to then be done to show that this isn't damaging for teenagers to lift weights. And I'm not saying that research wasn't important, it clearly was, but the rhetoric around it was very similar to the rhetoric that Karpovic and others were dispelling in the 40s and 50s. So you can see there's two strands, and Karpovic doesn't lift. He's just a very, open and intellectually curious individual. But he is listening to the lifters and actually testing and validating it for himself. You have Karl Klein who's interacting with the lifters, but isn't maybe listening to them and is drawing his conclusions despite the evidence that's in front of him.
Yeah, it's such an interesting parallel because both Klein and Karpovic came in with similar biases, right? Karpovic is literally asking people to scratch their shoulders because he thinks they can't. And if he thought it was necessary to test lifters' IQs, that tells you about where he and the rest of his ilk's biases lay before that. But I think it's really interesting that, like I said before, there's nothing inherently wrong with bias. We have beliefs, and they're basically one and the same. It's just that if you are a scientist, you need to have the willingness to challenge your beliefs, because ultimately that's your damn job. And when you don't have that willingness, we see things like, Karpovic converting basically to weightlifting as a positive, and Klein kind of always shifting the goalposts to hold on to the truth that he already had believed, that weightlifting is injurious in some way, despite the fact that, even as a trained scientist, he should know the data he has is not supportive of that. So I just think that's a cautionary tale or an interesting observation, but it does tell us a lot about why we are where we are today and why we are still dealing with some of these issues. And honestly, Connor, you're right. Lifting weights is weird, and to the person who has never done it before, the first time doing it, it feels uncomfortable, even when you're at 10 reps from failure, even when it's not that heavy. I remember when I was heavily already inundated with lifting, I began as a personal trainer, and I had a lot of disconnects between the language I would use and my clients. I had someone do 15 reps on a goblet squat, and they're like, that's heavy. And my first thought was, by definition, that is not heavy if you're doing 15 reps. Actually, but what are they comparing it to? That is heavy for them. Based on what their experience is. They've never, they can get up and off the toilet more than 15 times in a row. So I think it's just a really interesting thing that we forget the things that to us were quite surprising when we first started lifting. And sometimes we kind of look at everyone who doesn't lift as these ignorant fools. But in reality, it's just a lack of exposure, which is very understandable.
And I mean, you two have really done great work in exposing yourselves on multiple occasions to the general public. And I mean, obviously, like your clients they need to be told to try harder. I mean, we're all in broad agreement with that. But I mean, to potentially, make a serious point, which I'm loath to do, lifters are kind of responsible for this as well, which is sort of the dirty little secret in all of this, because in the 1890s, 1900s, and early 1910s, a lot of the strongmen, the physical culturists, the weightlifters and bodybuilders of their time, aren't promoting heavy weightlifting to the general public.
Right.
They're saying light weightlifting, light dumbbell lifting is all that you need. And unfortunately now, late Terry Todd has a wonderful article called The Muscle-Bound Athlete, where he says that, there's a 40-year period, the exact same period when there's no research from the scientific community on lifting, in which physical culturists are saying, oh, you only need to lift light dumbbells or do calisthenics to, get ripped, to get lean, to get muscular, to be healthy. And like Eugen Sandow, who clearly lifted heavy weights for his time, he sold effectively a resistance band and a 5-pound dumbbell that had springs in it. I own several. They're fun. The idea is that you kind of crush the springs together to really increase the resistance, and then you can lift the dumbbells and increase your concentration with them as you lift. It's fun, but it's not going to produce the body that Sandow has. You have someone like Charles Atlas, the insult that made a man out of Mac, probably the most influential fitness advertisement ever, even comparing that to the Instagram age. And Charles Atlas is saying, if you don't do my dynamic tension system, which is just like resistance training using your own body, calisthenics and kind of isometric training, you will be muscle bound, you will be clumsy, you will be slow, and you need to actually forgo all weights whatsoever and just use my body weight system. Even though we have photos of Charles Atlas lifting weights in his 20s. The truth doesn't matter, but if we think about the actual lifting community itself, the few people who are saying that's all BS, lift heavy weights, are also unfortunately the people who are tending to pass away sooner than the lifters who are saying just lift heavy weights. So like Arthur Saxon, incredible strongman, he dies just after the First World War. I suppose Eugen Sandow dies of a brain aneurysm, so maybe not the best, or syphilis, depending on whose biography you read. I know which story I prefer. But you know, you have someone like Charles Atlas who's into longevity. You have people like J.P. Mueller, who's a Scandinavian physical culturist. You have Bernard McFadden in the United States, who's into calisthenics. They're all pushing lightweight training. They very rarely talk about heavyweight training, and if they do, they say it almost like, you know, the modern equivalent would be like a bodybuilder who like, oh, I just did, you know, I did test once, or you know, like I did steroids once, you know, like 20 years ago. Like, what if you're gonna do it, I guess just do it like under supervision. But you know, whatever. It's like, you know, oh yeah, I did weightlifting for a little bit. If you're interested in it, you know, try that. But everyone just needs light dumbbells or developers. So the rhetoric from the burgeoning fitness community is coming at a time when there's no scientific, really any scientific study of heavyweight training. And the reason why the physical culturists are saying it, and this is going back to Eric's client who clearly needed to try harder, I do say that tongue in cheek, is it's a lot easier to sell lightweight training to the general public than it is to sell heavyweight training to the general public. And it's a lot easier to say, oh, you can look like Eugen Sandow, who's literally called the world's most perfectly developed specimen by Dudley Allen Sargent, who's a Harvard physical educationist who actually studies people's bodies in the 1890s, 1900s. He's doing that for incredibly racist and problematic reasons, but we don't need to go into that. But he says, you know, Sandow's body is the best ever. And then Sandow is saying, oh, you just need to lift my light dumbbells and you can be like me. Versus, you know, I watch my diet, I train X amount of times a week, you know, I lift to a certain intensity. So the lifting community being driven by a profit motive is really, I suppose, has a really influential part to play in the general ignorance and stigma around lifting in general, because it's very easy for Sandow to say like, oh, I'm not like the other lifters because, you know, I do lightweight, like I'm respectable, and it's those gym rats over there, they're the idiots who are getting injured and are doing dangerous stuff. But you know, I'm respectable, you can buy my stuff, you can use my stuff. And then Charles Atlas, I'm super respectable, I don't use any, you know, equipment whatsoever, I'm super respectable. So we can see that the lifting community actually has a little bit to answer for. And then there's also a tension between physical educationists in America, like PE teachers, who are trying to just kind of save their own asses. And they're saying like our PE programs are more influential or more important or are healthier than the weightlifting programs. Don't do weightlifting, do PE, do gymnastics. And I'll end this rant on one fantastic anecdote that Terry Todd Zantod and Jason Shirley have in their book, The History of Strength Training or Coaching in America. Or Tate McKenzie is one of the most influential physical educationists in America in the 1900s, early 1900s, 1910s, 1920s. In one of his books in 1924, he has a photograph of a heavily muscular man who we are told drowned after that photograph was taken. And unfortunately for this unnamed figure, and we've never been able to corroborate the story, he wasn't able to float in the sea because he had too much muscle. So it's a cautionary tale that I think shows just the broader bias and problems within the fitness sphere, and also why every lifter should be in a gym with a pool.
I mean, this is why swimmers don't lift weights, because they would die. I mean, it's pretty much that straightforward. Mm-hmm.
It's why I wear a life jacket wherever I go, because you never know what situation you'll be in. I will say, Connor, this is wild to me because really what you're saying, so you're saying it's aliens. We're critiquing capitalism here, Eric, because it's the market that is ultimately deciding what people will buy. And I do think it's a case because we see this in modernity, to draw a connection. It's the path of least resistance. So they are responsible as individuals participating in the market. Absolutely. Eugene Sandow, who, you know, both myself and Eric were like, oh, that's the man. Look at his physique. Look at what he's done. But at the same time, when there's an economic consideration, when they're trying to have a financial incentive to, you know, grow their business, I could see immediately think about the opposition that you would encounter because it's a new idea. If you spoke about, you know, resistance training, getting stronger, progressive overload, all these things that are so foreign to individuals that I assume there'd be barriers of entry. And when you try and proselytize like a new idea, you face a lot more resistance than if you're saying things that sound, as Eric and myself joked about, like the truthiness of it. It's like, oh, like me, like what I get for this physique, there's that element of ease, which has an appeal to it, where you can do it, it's achievable, here's a framework. Don't you want to look like, so you're playing on the emotions. I wonder if, and maybe you can answer this, you know, Connor, and we joked in the Try Harder episode, our catch-all at Iron Culture is, have you tried trying? Like when people ask us any question, that's the first response that we give them. But here's my question to you. Do we have any evidence that some of these early iron enthusiasts attempted to basically market actually what they're doing first, and then failed, and then they kind of adapted along the way? Or was there maybe from the get-go they made these jumps, and maybe this is tenuous what I'm saying, that, you know, maybe they thought, oh, it wouldn't have appeal, and they just straight went to it because they thought, you know what, this is easier to transport, like with Atlas. Think about this, selling barbells across America, like, or heavyweights, just even from a financial standpoint, that's a limiting factor. So maybe that was it, as opposed to the belief of people. But do we have any early evidence that some of these iron enthusiasts tried selling or peddling other things before they basically started peddling more junky shit?
I mean, there's a lot of junky shit that gets sold. And yeah, we have a lot of evidence of people trying something, failing, and then coming back like quite soon afterwards with something cheaper and easier to manage. And actually, Eugene Sandow is a great example of that. He publishes a book when he's in the US in 1894. It's like Sandow on Physical Training with G.W. Mercer. And the exercise machine, it's very hard for me to even describe what it looks like. It's effectively Sandow in a seat with like knee braces on his knees. And then he's also holding on to two poles. And he's going to move the poles and the knee braces at the same time.
Pec fly and leg extension.
Boom. There we go. Efficiency. The superset that everyone needed to do but didn't know. Your personal trainer will hate this one tip that we give you. So Sandow tries that. Like, it fails. Badly fails. He goes back to Britain. In Britain, there are already people peddling certain dumbbells and certain pulleys. So the Sandow developer, which is then his next, I suppose, attempt at marketing some form of exercise equipment, that actually been sold by the Whiteley company for like 5-6 years prior to that time. Initially, it's the Sandow and Whiteley developer, and then it becomes the Sandow developer. So he sort of monopolizes what they're trying to do. He then moves on to the spring grip dumbbell. This isn't his idea. It is floating around before that. Edmond Debenay in France has a similar dumbbell. In Britain, there's an individual called Professor Szalay, S-Z-A-L-A-Y, who also markets a spring grip dumbbell around the same time. In his, like, I've studied Sandow, fascinating character, very important for the fitness industry. Undoubtedly an aggressive asshole when it came to product protection. He sues Professor Szalay, effectively drives him into bankruptcy, one of the most influential early weightlifting coaches in Britain, the man who coached Launceston Elliott, who wins a gold medal at the 1896 Olympic Games in weightlifting. He drives him into penury. Then 10 years later has the temerity to donate money to a fundraiser for Szalay, who has fallen on hard times.
Oh my God.
And is then seen as the great benefactor, Eugene Sandow. Like, look how nice this man is. It's like stealing something from him, like taking a man's livelihood and then giving him a jacket 10 years later. This is a fact, and then expecting kudos. But Sandow has a failure. That was a rant. I'm so sorry. It's just I've been researching this, the lawsuits between Szalay and Sandow, and the people need to know. So Sandow fails, tries again. Those two things are a big hit. He needs to go down that laneway or that path because there isn't a barbell manufacturer in England at that time who could, I suppose, keep up with the demand that Sandow would have. We then have another obvious example is Charles Atlas, who, as I said, appears in early advertisements in the 1920s with barbells and dumbbells, then comes back 5-6 years later saying dynamic tension, which is his kind of isometric bodyweight resistance program, is the be all and end all. So he realizes that if he's just another barbell and dumbbell peddler, like there's no money in it. He's just going to be like a cover model for that. There's no real money in it for him. He joins forces with an advertising executive called Charles Roman, and they market the ever-living hell out of his dynamic tension system of training. So we do have like two clear instances, and there are multiple other instances of people who have built themselves up with heavyweight training saying, you know what, that's clearly not going to fly. I'm going to peddle any manner of means of other things to attract people in. And the problem is they're quite respectable in the general public. Like Sandow, he's the personal trainer to the King of England. He's appointed in 1911. He opens up his own medical clinic in 1907 called the Sandow Curative Institute. They're the figureheads of the fitness community. So if you're not, I suppose, part of the fitness community, you're looking to them as the spokespeople. And they're saying, no, heavy weightlifting is dangerous. Just do light weightlifting. So yeah, I think the commercial element from the fitness perspective is deeply problematic and makes one feel very queasy inside.
Mm. So yeah, I think that's really insightful, and I'm really glad that you brought that up, Omar. The logistics of, well, why are they marketing things that aren't heavyweight training? Well, it's like there aren't gyms yet, really. I mean, there's like sporting facilities, and like it's lifting weights is so rare as to be considered a circus act. Can we get people to buy barbells? I mean, it doesn't seem like anyone was successful at that for at least until the 30s, and even now, correct me if I'm wrong, Connor, but like Bob Hoffman did a great job at selling, barbells and weights all over the U.S., but he kind of subsidized that with his other business, didn't he?
Yeah, so he had his oil burner business, which was his kind of bread and butter, which subsidized it. I mean, prior to Hoffman, there's Alan Calvert, who
That's
has
right.
the Milo Barbell Company, who like is very successful, but in like
Mm.
a small scale. You know, it's Hoffman who really brings it out to the masses. And like I said, that's the 1930s. And
Yeah.
I mean, I suppose problematically, we have an individual, and I think I've mentioned him on this podcast before, George Barker Winship in America in the 1800s, who creates a health lift, which is like a partial deadlift machine. And he's telling people, lift heavy on this, this will
Oh
improve your health,
yeah.
your strength. He's a doctor, who's trained himself with this system. He's telling people lifting heavy is important. There are health lift gymnasiums popping up all over the East Coast and the West Coast. He dies at the age of 42 from a massive heart attack.
The heart attack that set us back 30 years.
At
At
least.
least, yeah.
Yeah.
Oh,
So we
man.
can see that there's not a great history here from a fitness perspective. And there are a lot of false starts and false dawns. And like there's infighting in the fitness community, which is then spilling out into quite trashy research in the scientific community. And it is just going into it with bias and prejudice. And if you have a hammer, everything looks like a nail. And that's
Mm.
really influencing the findings that are being shown. But like the fitness industry is its own worst enemy in this, because even like Carl Klein, like kind of going back to Omar's point, but like why would he talk to the fitness community when after he published these studies, they're just ragging on him and making fun of him. And every second week in Strength and Health magazine, John Grimmick is calling you an idiot and saying
Yeah.
that your research is completely spurious. Especially if you're like a scientist, it's not a huge incentive to deal with these people. So I think sometimes the fitness community is its own worst enemy with its public perception.
Yeah. No, I can totally understand. I mean, once the heart of what you do is attacked, you double down, burn the bridges, and then you also shut down lines of communication and opportunities for people to have that more open-minded conversion, like we saw with Karpovic, which I think it's a very heartwarming story. How the skeptic becomes the proselytizer, and how long does that go on for? I mean, how much of an effect do you think Karpovic has on making lifting a little more mainstream and getting people to maybe walk back their fears on lifting?
I mean, he's one of the most influential figures in American exercise science. He publishes or he co-authors the first, I suppose, scientifically backed training book, and that's Weight Training in Athletics with Jim Murray, which is published, I think, initially in 1956, and there's another edition in 1983. And this, I suppose, helps to give some legitimacy to training, because prior to that time, training books are, Bob Hoffman, here's 12 exercises to improve your virility, versus like, this scientifically based, like there's footnotes and there's research being mentioned in the book. And he also, himself and his wife and other individuals, helped found the American College of Sports Medicine in 1954. Like, and this is coming from someone who initially thinks that all weight trainers are, like snake oil salesmen, and they need to be, I suppose, called out on their incorrect beliefs, and that they need to stop with these dangerous lies and these dangerous practices. So we can see that Karpovic, like, actually is a really important part in this story, because he does start to bridge the gap between the sport medicine community, which he is a part of, and the lifting community, because the book he co-authors is with a weightlifter and with a weightlifting coach. So he is working with them, but like never in a, like, because now if I say, oh, someone's working with a supplement company, sometimes, you can be like, oh, okay, I see what's going on. Someone realized where the money is. But this is a mutual, like a mutual relationship. And I think it's one built on respect. And I mean, what's interesting is, so we've talked about Klein, we've talked about Karpovic, who aren't lifters, to my knowledge. There's also Thomas Delorme,
Mm.
who people are probably very familiar with. He's also part of this generation. So for people who are unaware, if you've ever injured yourself and gone to a physio, you'll probably, or physiotherapist, you'll probably have been told at some point in your life, do 3 sets of 10 reps and just left it at there. That's the watered down introduction I was given to Delorme's, magnum opus of work. I injured my knee. I went to a physiotherapist who wasn't very good. And he's like, oh, just do 3 sets of 10 reps. It's like, lifting heavier each time, like trying to increase the reps. Or he's like, no, 3 of 10, you'll be fine. But Delorme is a lifter in the 1920s and 1930s. He goes into sports science and exercise science. He becomes very interested in rehabilitation because when he comes to exercise science, it is the time of the Second World War. More and more and more American men are coming home from the war with knee and joint problems and pain. And this could be anywhere from an amputee to someone who has, torn their ACL. And first by rehabilitating himself because he has his own health problems. And there are stories of Delorme using like iron boots, which are these like heavy boots that you strap to your feet, and you can use like you can do leg curls and leg extensions with them. And he did like hundreds of reps to, build up his strength again. But Delorme, with this incredible, um, population of eager servicemen who are injured, wanting to rehabilitate themselves, he uses his own lifting knowledge. I'm going to use weight training. I'm going to use progressive overload. I'm going to see what happens. And he gets incredible results with these soldiers. So he starts to publish papers on heavy resistance training from the mid-1940s. One of his first papers is called The Restoration of Muscle Power by Heavy Resistance Exercises. He uses 300 case studies. He is combining his own knowledge of weightlifting with this eager pool of men who want to get stronger and healthier. And he gets a, quote, splendid response in muscle hypertrophy and power, together with symptomatic relief through weight training. He's getting his patients to adhere to like anywhere from 7 to 10 sets of 10 reps. They're starting off light, they're ramping up to their 10 rep max. And he is doing this again and again and again. And what's interesting for me is Delorme and Watkins, who is his co-author on a lot of this, are publishing really excellent, sound research on progressive weight training and overload. But when they start to move away from the scientific community, so think about that 1945 paper, Restoration of Muscle Power by Heavy Resistance Exercises. But that's quite a bold statement to have at that time, like heavy resistance exercises. When he starts to publish his work for the general public, he calls it progressive resistance exercise. He astutely, and Omar, this is going back to your point about selling an idea, as he progresses, he pulls heavy out of the title of what he's trying to do and puts in progressive. He puts in other terms to scale it down and make it more accessible for individuals. And I think this is interesting because then we start to see his ideas being watered down. We're moving away from 7 to 10 sets. We're moving away from ramping up the weight. And I know people do adhere to this sort of progressive overload and ramping it up, but there are multiple stories of Delorme sort of despairing at the fact that people just do 3 sets of 10. It's like, well, it's not, it's 50%, 75%, 100% to your 10 rep max, but then it starts to get watered down. But it is interesting that even with someone who's doing great research, like really impactful research, he's helping veterans, he's starting to help people with knee pain, the same thing that Carl Klein is trying to achieve. He has to water it down, So I mean, it's just the state of lifting research in the 50s and 60s that even the people who know the benefits that progressive resistance training can have and are doing really good research in that vein know that they can't sell it whole hog, like that they need to water it down to make it palatable. And maybe that's good, maybe that's the Trojan horse, but it also indicates the state of where we're at, in that mid 20th century.
I think Delorme is such an important figure, and it's interesting. I've never heard the perspective that the terminology of progressive was to avoid the term heavy, because I think the understanding progressive overload, of course, is like the cornerstone of all understanding of scientific principles of weight training. So to me, Delorme's always been like the one who got people to think about progressive overload. Of course, it's there's roots, and progressive overload's been around a lot longer than Delorme. Don't get me wrong. Shout out Milo, but and his calf, not his calves. Sorry, Omar, but his calf that grew into a full size bull. But yeah, it's just it's interesting to me that there was likely a perspective on his part of, look, this is good for people, but I got to give them what they're willing to accept to get them to take it on board. So that's really interesting. That's the first time I've heard that, Connor.
Yeah, and I mean, it's something that I think is just embedded into the culture around that time when it comes to the study of strength training. And again, say to go back to James Nuzzo's article, it is just fascinating to see that when we get to the late 50s, early 60s, there is this incredible uptake in research being done on strength training. But before that time, like, you are a pioneer, like Karl Klein is a pioneer because he's studying this, and he's admittedly coming up with the wrong findings on it, but he's putting research out there where people aren't doing research. Delorme is a pioneer who's still celebrated for it. Karpovic is still celebrated for it, etc. But like, there is just this dearth, and there are reasons for that. The exercise science community is more concerned with cardiovascular fitness, in that first half of the century. The fitness community itself is just infighting and causing a huge amount of problems. And it is only when we start to get more and more lifters going into sports science or exercise science that I think we really do start to see a sea change. And you can track. So Bob Hoffman's Strength and Health starts in 1932. Hoffman becomes more and more powerful in the 1930s. There is no coincidence whatsoever. By the late 40s, early 50s, we're starting to get actually good research on sports science and exercise science. That has very little to do with the science that's being produced, and I think it has a lot more to do with the popularity of weight training.
Absolutely. And I think, as much as we talked about the origin of some of the lab coats who don't lift kind of stereotype of the sports science community, it really was the fact that from the very get-go, lifters have been scientifically interested, sometimes for maybe more marketing reasons, but certainly, like, you can go back into the same era we're talking about, and lifters, maybe it's because we have that B plus, average IQ level, are interested in, okay, well, how can we get even better gains with science? And then I don't think that's not too many steps far removed of lifters actually entering the academic field of studying lifting. The ACSM, great example. And then, of course, we eventually have NSCA. We have the growth of the profession of being a strength conditioning coach, because you'd think maybe the anti-lifting sentiment in the athletic community would be less. It's not. I've met coaches, even at this day, in certain sports where lifting is not really a requirement, but a potential add-on, that still carry some of these biases and beliefs about lifting, which still blows my mind. And it's different in different regions, language barriers slow down the flow of communication for sure. And you will find some countries, sprinters just don't lift, even in modern times, or it's much less common, which honestly kind of would blow your mind when you think about the physiques of sprinters in most English-speaking countries. They could step on a bodybuilding stage in most cases and do pretty well. So anyway, I'd love to hear more about that, Connor, on how lifters begin to actually influence the production of science rather than always being at odds with it.
And sorry, just when you said sprinters, there's definitely a future podcast for you guys. But do you remember the meme about the sprinter? And it was like, this is what high intensity interval training does. This is what long cardio does. And it's the like emaciated marathon runner. So much of my knowledge comes from memes from the late, from the early 2000s. So it's a wonderful place to be. But yeah, like, I think it's an interesting thing to think about. And, mentioning about the athletic community, again, that book, The History or the Invention of Strength Coaching in America by Jan Todd, Terry Todd, and Jason Shirley, it came out in 2019. It's fascinating because it is the prehistory and then the history of things like the NCSA or the National Strength and Conditioning Association.
NSCA.
And thank you very much. And it's late at night for me, and I also started this podcast looking like a potato. Not very much an audio medium, but hey ho. But there are stories of early strength and conditioning coaches being told, I'm going to give you a 6-month trial, and if anyone gets slower, you're fired, or I'm going to give you a 6-month trial. And if anyone gets weaker or muscle bound, like if my wide receiver gets clumsy, you are fired. And that is sort of the basis of what they're dealing with. But in terms of the, lifters becoming scientists, Bob Hoffman is incredibly important in this story. And like, John Fair's Muscletown, USA, Bob Hoffman, I don't know if I would like to share a meal with him. He had some very interesting ideas about women. He had some very interesting ideas about what was and was not progressive with his lifters. But Bob Hoffman is on a zeal. He has a messianic zeal when it comes to spreading weight training among the general populace. He is then joined by Joe Weider, who is also trying to push weight training. They will both produce journals and magazines in the 1950s that are not called, Strength and Health. They're not saying anything about weightlifting. They're given the names of like American Athlete or The American Athlete, where they're targeting teenage boys and they're saying, oh, you play football. Here's how you can improve, you're 40. Here's how you can get stronger. They are targeting the general public, but Bob Hoffman is continually trying to get respectability for weightlifting. And you can see like Fraser Ferguson, whose name is now kind of burned into my name. His name is Robert Paulson. Fraser Ferguson is, like undergrad at Springfield College. And he's like, hey, do you and John Grimmick and John Davis want to travel from, Pennsylvania to Springfield and like maybe lift in front of my class? It's like, oh yeah, dude, no problem. Yeah, we'll be like Tuesday. Is Tuesday work? Okay, we'll be down on Tuesday. Like he jumps at the opportunity to enlighten the scientific community. In his writings are like reverse snobbery from the 1930s. So what I mean by that is he's like, oh, we lifters know better than the ignorant masses who are unhealthy, who are physically weak. They don't get it, but you get it. Like there is a cultish vibe to this. And actually Dominic Moraes, who you had on this podcast way back when, his dissertation is talking about the brand community that Hoffman created around York Barbell. And like it's one step below cult. So it's not the Iron Cult, but it's one step below that sort of cult. Like people are drinking the Bob Hoffman Kool-Aid, which if people listen to our history of supplements episode, you don't want to drink anything that Bob Hoffman has mixed. That's not a nefarious element. That is a lax safety protocols statement.
You're just drinking Bob Hoffman.
You're just drinking in Bob Hoffman, and take that statement in any way that you wish.
Literally.
But Bob Hoffman, he's writing editorials from the 1930s about why the general public needs to be enlightened on the value of exercise. He is sending out his lifters to give demonstrations throughout the United States in a variety of different ways, shapes, and means. Like he's sending 2 of his best lifters to Springfield to prove a nerd in a lab coat wrong, for want of a better phrase. He will progress to sending barbell kits out to high schools and universities at a discount. He will write multiple journals targeting the general public and not the general lifting public. And I think Joe Weider will also copy him and do this in his own vein as well. But I think there is a commercial element to that. Like if I can get more people lifting, that's better. Some of them will want to progress on and learn more. But there's also a sort of like vocational aspect to that as well. And I think a lot of those early lifters who went into the scientific community, a lot of them would cite Strength and Health magazine or one of the Hoffman and Weider magazines as inspiration for them wanting to study and know more or wanting to learn more. Because they're like, I've been reading for like 20 years now or 15 years or 10 years that like squats are good and that weight training will make me a better football player. I'm in university. I want to study. I want to know more. Like Thomas Delorme, you cannot divorce his lifting passion and his love of Strength and Health magazine from the research that he then does. Even the fact that the early lifters, when they're doing scientific work, like one of Delorme's exercise protocols is getting people to do leg extensions with iron boots. Iron boots are a product sold primarily by Bob Hoffman and York Barbell. Leg extensions, I know it's obvious, but that exercise is primarily known within the lifting community at that time, not the calisthenic or gymnastics community. So they're coming in with a base of knowledge that other people don't have. Many of them have that vocational idea or understanding of lifting, which Bob Hoffman and Joe Weider and others have been kind of feeding them, for many, many decades. And many of them are just interested in knowing more and progressing more. So I think, like, as I said, we have Hoffman in the 30s really expanding weight training. You then have the boom in the 40s and 50s. I think it's a natural unintended consequence. And then because there's, to quote my late grandmother, there's Chagall research, prior to that point, like you're going into a field where you have a lot of embodied knowledge and lived knowledge, and you've read a lot about it. And you're like, really? No one's done a study on this before? So I can do that. Like that's, what I mean? So then I can build up this knowledge. I can work on the knee joint. I can work on the shoulder joint. So you're like the kid in the candy store because you get to do the first studies on it. So I think there's all of these different things coming together, and it's not to be too poetic about it, but there is something magical about the fact that it all starts to coalesce sort of within the same 10 years, and then it's built up, and we're getting organizations like the American College of Sport Medicine, like the Strength and Conditioning Associations, emerging like the decade after that, or 2 decades after that. Like there is a tipping point in the 50s and 60s, both in the lifting community, but also then within the scientific community. And the people pioneering that are the ones who have a foot in both camps.
And there's so many parallels to that today. Like I only got into academia because I loved lifting and I was curious about it and I wanted to understand it more, promote it, find ways to do it better, find ways to minimize cons, accentuate pros. So I think that's something a lot of people can relate to, and I think that's probably why a lot of our listeners listen to this podcast, because they have that same level of curiosity that came from a passion for lifting weights. And I think it's just encouraging. I know sometimes when we look at history, either we make assumptions about similarities or we make assumptions about differences that may or may not be the case. And I think this is one instance where that same curiosity, that similarity to what people still have today who decide to, I want to do a master's degree in exercise science or nutrition, what have you. That was present then and was kind of the first steps towards being at the point where we are today, where there are very lifting-centric academic programs and certifications. So yeah, I think that's kind of cool. And it is it's always good to hear these historical examples too, because if like right now, if the most popular narrative was a new study that came out, published, and everyone was buying into it, that squats exploded your knees, people would be freaking out. Like, this is going to destroy the world. Everything's going to be gone. And I'm sure they were at that point, which is why you saw that vitriolic backlash against Karl Klein. But it helps us understand that, if science is done properly, which it doesn't need to be done properly by every single scientist, because it won't be, because scientists, unfortunately, are humans. We haven't yet ascended to being uploaded into machines and removed our emotions, which make us a worse perfect machine. The general sentiment of trying to pursue the scientific method, pursue truth, and overcomes one's biases, it's generally self-correcting and moves in the right direction, but it does take sometimes decades or even multiple decades, like I think we've understood from this, and there will still be hang-ons from that era and kind of these just implicit biases or beliefs we have, which may not be rooted in fact. So anyway, I just find that really interesting. Omar, anything you want to say on this topic? Because,
Two things.
You can say both. I'll allow it.
En français. As someone said, they said in the comment section, they said, "Au contraire, mon frère." And I'm like, I want an actual French speaker to evaluate the broken français from a Canadian. They're like, it's terrible. Don't even try. Like I can't even understand what you're saying. I think in the same way where you're talking about academia now, Eric, we could really see the progress as it relates just in general to prominent strength coaches or people in the fitness industry. Like you spoke, Connor, how, divisive now, like a Bob Hoffman would be with some of his stances. And I'm just glad we have no one in the modern context that espouses similar sentiments, like no one that's a prominent, potentially like strength coach or has written a book that's influenced so many people that has downright harmful opinions about everything outside of lifting, beyond misogyny or, not even possessing human decency, and maybe things like denying climate change as being a thing. It's just fortunate that we don't have those figures in the modern context, and so we just leave that behind. It's kind of like, Karl Klein's like, oh, don't do the half bends, or like if you do, just do the quarter bends or whatnot. we're in the Enlightenment era. I think it's safe to say. So we've done away with kind of that baggage, and we're just ready to move on. So that's the first thing I want to say. I don't know if Connor, if you want to say anything before I go on to the second point.
I think just sometimes it's important to know that there, to my knowledge, hasn't been any subsequent study to Karpovic's IQ test of lifters, and I think that, you know, one study does not a summer make. So maybe there is potential for an entire field to really look at that, especially within an internet age.
Right. Yeah.
Continue.
Yeah, absolutely. And so this isn't the second point, but just as an aside, it is amusing to me that potentially two of the most prominent events that have happened when it comes to fitness research, exercise research, was that individual dying at the age of 42 that was a proponent of strength training that just set us back like decades. Like that singular event kind of just set back the research of one. And then two, with Karpovic, where like the like watershed moment that he's like, oh man, he's like, yeah, but I bet you're a muscle bound hunk. Like I bet you can't touch. And then he sees the guy touch behind his back. He's like, oh fuck. Like that was like the moment for him. You know what I mean? Like the watershed moment in the fitness space where he's like, I messed up. Like that. Before he was so sure, he was just like, well, you touch your back. And then as soon as it happened, he was like, oh, I got to rethink everything. It's kind of amusing. Like when you tell these stories.
Took the red pill.
he's just seeing it before his eyes. He's like, I have a lot to think about after this. And I do wonder how long it took before, you know, the revisions happened. My question for both of you was going to be related to just dogmatism that becomes developed or ingrained, in particular in the fitness space, and how it comes to be. You know, these historical narratives that we see, they're almost cyclical, and this is like a joke, but not a joke. There's once again a prominent, let's just say, coach that's talking about not squatting, you know, to parallel the harmful effects. Now, I think this person is using the savviness of marketing of some ingrained beliefs to try and like gain relevance. So that's a little different. But how we develop these dogmatic beliefs that are kind of, as Eric said, they're biases and beliefs not etched in reality. It's more, it feels good. And one thing I'll bring up today, Eric, I don't know if you saw it. I thought it wouldn't be controversial. My elbow's a little tweaked, just as an example, Connor. And so I'm doing, after 4 weeks of not deadlifting, I'm using the trap bar. Haven't used trap bar in a long period of time. For me, it's a laziness factor where you don't have the bar jack, so you can't like load it up, take it off, cool, whatever. There was a fantastic article, I will say this, and he got way more vitriol. Greg Nuckols, just talking about the utility of it, like when it could be good in terms of application. I thought a very nuanced, well-written article considering a lot of different factors. Cool. 4 years after the fact, like you assume it's like, hey, if it feel like, you know, it works the hip extensors, the back musculature, also maybe the quads a little bit more. It's still a hinge pattern if you do it, Like we got over that, right? Anyways, I post it, and the amount of people that follow me, they're like, oh, it's junk. Or like, why are you doing? Or like, nice low rack pulls. Like, at no point did I say, hey, this is the same as doing like a conventional deadlift. I'm stating that this number that I hit is the same, and I just felt like I was having a conversation with people back in 2005. So I'm curious from both of you, both in academia and also just the experiential knowledge, how do you think it comes about, some of these deeply ingrained beliefs where you have the people that challenge it, that then eventually will overcome some of maybe these naive notions that just get like baked into us. And we're all guilty. Like I've had this. I was actually, when we have that episode, I would love to, that's where the self-flagellation is going to occur for me when we talk about the sprinter versus the marathon runner. Because my experience, Eric, was with sprinters. I'm like, oh, they are pretty jacked. And then you see like marathon runners and you're like, oh, they are pretty skinny, right? So like I think I shared that image in a 2010 like video. So I'm 100% guilty. So I'm not saying I'm above it. I'm in the mix, but I have 2% now self-awareness. So dogmatism in the fitness space, we still see elements of it today. How do you think it still is fertile ground in the social media era?
Want me to start, Connor, or you got thoughts?
Yeah, no, you go. I have feels, but you go so I can get thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, my first one is I think that most people, part of the motivational strategies that are most effective in the lifting community are joining a community, joining a group, identifying. So it has to come down to self-identity. And if your identity is around specific exercises, then the other, ironically, is I don't know, moving a barbell differently, as ridiculous as that is, or how dare you turn that barbell into a diamond shape and stand in the middle. How dare you shift that load 3 inches backward, you know? and change the place where we arbitrarily pull from because somebody back in the day decided a 45-pound plate should be X distance from the floor. That changes everything. That's not natural. You think cavemen were lifting rocks? No, they found barbells left by aliens 2,000 years ago. And yes, I just said cavemen were 2,000 years ago. So, yeah, I honestly don't think people actually think through their comments. I think these are very, once they have a group identity, which is, typically something that is I will be charitable. Most people, it's a phase, when people who do stick with lifting for the long term, they go through enough life experiences, they meet other people, they expand their circle a little bit, they experience injury, they get bored, try new stuff, or they quit and come back. And they tend to broaden their horizons a little bit. So it's one of those things where you kind of have to just go, "Oh, ye young lifter, aren't you adorable?" I remember when I was like that, like you just did, Omar.
No.
But I don't think that's going anywhere, and I don't think it's the fault of social media, and I don't think it's the fault of, maybe it's accelerated or amplified, but I really do think it's just kind of human nature.
As someone who actually managed to buy an original Al Girard is the person who invented the trap bar deadlift. I have an original Al Girard bar. I feel triggered by any comments against the trap bar deadlift because I use it and I love it. So there. But on...
How long ago was it developed, just out of my own curiosity?
So 1980s, I think 1986 is the first time it appeared in Powerlifting USA. It's quite a new phenomenon. It will not surprise you to learn that he was very injured and and had a lot of problems. And he then realized that by shifting the angles a little bit, turning it into the diamond, he could continue to deadlift. Yeah, 1986. So it's so new. You wouldn't hate someone who was born in 1986. Well, actually, probably at this point you would. But it's a newer element to the fitness industry. Let's all get along. On dogmatism, it's not new with social media. Something that Jan Todd has used in her own research, which I think actually works quite well, and I'm going to be slightly annoying and academic at this point, but Thomas Kuhn's very influential idea of a paradigm shift. Now, this idea of paradigm, we can effectively define it as, a certain set of theories that all exist within the same sphere. So if we all agree that squats are bad for your knees, that is our working paradigm. We will continue to produce studies that squats are bad for your knees until we come up against something that we cannot explain. So say if, Carl Klein publishes his paper and then we spend the next 10 years publishing, replicating that result or creating new papers based on that original finding. But then we're like, oh crap, we have people who are in their 50s and 60s who've been lifting for 40 years. Their knees are okay. Okay, maybe we need to tweak or change this paradigm or come up with an entirely new paradigm and way of being. Now, this idea, it's kind of cultural relativism within the scientific community, like, oh, it's all relative, nothing matters, which is true, but that's life. But we don't need to go existential. But these paradigms exist within the fitness community. They never die, and they continue to go in very interesting cyclical ways. What I will say with social media is we've created multiple sub-communities within the fitness community. They always existed, but it was different in the 50s and 60s when, say we're all based in the US. I don't know, I might read Flex Magazine, Strength and Health, and Muscle Builder. That's where I'm going to get my information from. Every now and then, Arnold will publish a book or Franco will publish a book. I'll read that. That's pretty cool. And I'll go on with that. Now, if I go onto Reddit, I can go on to strongman, weightlifting, bodybuilding, natural bodybuilding, women's bodybuilding, fitness over 30, fitness over 40. And you'll see these ideas being proffered in these communities from experts who are valued within that community, but maybe pilloried in another community. And we can see that there's a lot of weight being put behind. So I think there is a group think within that. But I think the idea of paradigm works really well. So, if you shouldn't rest more than 30 seconds, that's the community that I'm part of. Everyone who I've seen has results who does that process. I'm going to ignore anyone who, I suppose, says differently, or I'm going to try and create explanations for why they seem to get different results. I think we hang on to these paradigms very strongly within the fitness community. There is obviously an objective truth. Lift heavy, lift often, don't overdo it. But I think we do see that then within that we do overcomplicate it, and we all want to know the truth. It has to be more complicated than what we're making it, right? Like, it's progressive overload, and really that's sort of it. Picking it up, putting it down. Now, I know we can get more complicated with it and we can advance it, but people do try and make it more complicated. And I think we need to go back to a wonderful T Nation meme I saw a few years ago, which is like, keto, low carb, high carb, it doesn't matter. We all agree. Vegans suck. And if we just twist that around ever so slightly, we're like, we're all lifters. Let's just, let's get along. We're still fighting against the ignorance from outside, which is saying, this is problematic. But I think, we hang on to explanatory models of how this works. And we attach so much to it, as Eric is saying, and we attach an identity to that. And then we shout at people who don't do that. So this is my roundabout way of saying, I trap bar deadlift with pride.
No, Connor, I love it. I do think an element potentially of a lot of groups when they define themselves is by what they're not. So it's who they are and then who they're not. It's like, well, wait a second. We definitely do the conventional deadlift. I remember years ago, think about the stigmatism. Eric can remember this too, of the sumo deadlift, right? Before it kind of became sanctioned, the moral authority. It's still highly contentious, don't get me wrong. But let's say like the IPF, like a governing body where it's like, it's allowed in this meet. It's the highest level of competition. So then that gave it like kind of the justification or some of the ammo that people needed, some of the research then that was done. But some of the lifting or just all of our inclinations are sort of personal preference where it's like who the fuck put spicy ketchup in my burger? It's like, I only eat ketchup. Like, it's disgusting. It's like, well, okay, you don't like it. That's fine. But like, it doesn't mean it's trash for everyone else. I do find it interesting to try and apply what Eric would say, like the principle of charity for some of these people. I will say like the trap bar, in some corners of this of the lifting space, some people don't declare that idea that if you use like the high handles, it simulates maybe like a low rack pull, so it's a little bit easier. So they'll use heavier weights, and then they'll basically try and claim it's similar to conventional deadlift. That's 1% though. With some of these people, it's like, well, but it's easier. It's like, is that a problem? You could just then lift more weight and have the same relative like proximity of failure and like intensity. It's, well, why would you do that? Why wouldn't you just do the conventional? It's like, well, maybe I prefer like the ease of the setup, like the neutral position feels more comfortable. I also could shift the pattern if I want to hinge, if I want. It's like, oh no. It's like you're basically, once you start poking holes, I think what you start encountering when you poke a bear is not that their idea is wrong, but you're questioning them, which questions their fabric of reality or their sense of like what is true. And as soon as you start poking some of those corners, then it starts becoming dangerous. Rather than re-examine themselves or some of the beliefs they have, or like, just have an open conversation, then it's like, no, I gotta kind of what is it, Carl Klein style, where he goes and he sees like the 159 elite lifters. He's doing this, and then he's like, force output, pretty damn trash, isn't it? Rather than like, let me follow this up. Let me ask these. Let me do some investigations here. He probably was the guy from Charles Atlas's ad that got sand kicked in his face because he was scrawny. Tried to squat, failed it, got injured. Then he's like, I'm gonna show them. So it is.
What they didn't know was that Bill Starr was that lifeguard who stole his girlfriend and kicked sand in his face.
Yeah, exactly, Eric. 100%. So I do think like dialogue, empathy, and compassion are the way forward. Obviously, when you're trying to like bring people together, it is just funny. That's why it's humorous because to both of your points, I definitely think it existed outside of social media. I think some ways, some corners, it could be amplified a little bit more. But it also is just interesting to me. This isn't at all a nihilistic standpoint. But when I say like it doesn't really matter to what you said, kind of like at the end of even if you harbor this intense belief, like for the person that chooses to do it, let's say it was like theoretically a trap bar deadlift was theoretically like 2%, stimulates muscles 2%. Let's say there was a concrete evidence that there was like a minor difference because everything we're dealing in gradients here. Like at the end of the day, for the person who's doing it, if there was actually something there, which it doesn't seem at all there is, like, is it really, the cross that you want to bear, like the crusade you want to wage? Like, is that what you want to occupy your time for? Like day in, day out, hours and hours on like message forums? I don't know. It seems like a waste of time.
Dude, bro, like we actually have data on this. Like competitive strongman training has 10 times the injury rate of bodybuilding. Yeah. But nobody cares.
Yeah.
That's not why. Like, I don't lift stones to failure or carry heavy objects as fast as I can because I'm thinking of doing the safest thing possible. I'm trying to do cool shit. And if you think looking jacked is cooler than me, like doing, Fingal's fingers or Conan's wheel, then you do you. I don't care if I get hurt more often. So it's always these silly comments that you're 100% right. Even if this stuff was true, really wouldn't matter.
Yeah.
Because that's not the motivation of people. It's not like, you know what I want to do in the lifting community today? Whatever has the lowest chance of hurting me for every 1,000 hours of training. I have no other motivation besides that except for being risk averse.
Man. Yeah.
I think the idea as well of defining yourself as something you're not, and that is something that we see in Karl Klein. Like, he defines himself as someone who is like above, I suppose, the noise around back squats, and he's doing the good research. And like, even now we see, like we mentioned, trap deadlift. One of my favorite encounters in the gym was seeing like a heavily muscular dude, like 280 pounds, like who's pulling an ungodly amount from the floor in sumo. And he had a t-shirt that had "Pull Sumo, Eat Butt" on the front, and then on the back it was, and this has stayed with me for over a decade, "Eat Ass, Gain Mass" on the back.
Okay.
And like, it was tongue in cheek. It was a response to the people who were, I suppose, pillaring people for pulling sumo. But the idea that an adult man would enter into a space with other people within that space with a t-shirt that had "Eat Ass, Gain Mass" on it, while grunting and heavily sweating within a public space, I think shows the power of defining oneself against a community as much as defining oneself within a community.
That's a great example. Well said.
We have no comments other than, I will say, I did preview at the start. When you said trap bar with pride, there was a small segment of a upcoming novella I'm working on that did leak. I don't know if Brandon edited it out or didn't, but yeah, I could say, Eric, I could say that out loud. It's, guess what? The person's name is Eric Helms that it stars. I'll start with that.
So, Omar, I think we're at this point in the podcast where I want to give the expert who we invited on the opportunity to see if there's anything else on the topic.
It's
of
interesting
squats.
Some of the situations he finds himself in is all I'll say. It's very complex.
Yeah, you cut out on that for me on that one. But Connor, Dr. Heffernan, I want to give you the opportunity. If there's anything on the topic of knees, squats, and anything else that wasn't said in the last 45 seconds that you want to comment on before we round this up, the floor is yours.
So this Eric guy gets into some pretty tricky situations.
It's pretty tricky. Yeah. Yeah, they're interesting, right? I think they're going to be relatable. I think everyone's going to feel the temperature in the room increases the reading this book, because some might say it's a little scandalous, it's a little scintillating, but that's just Eric.
I want to thank you, Dr. Connor Heffernan, for joining us on the Iron Culture podcast. This has been another fantastic episode where we can point to our value as educators and in helping people understand the history that has led them to where they are today. And with that, I want to just hand it over to Omar to only and nothing else close out this episode, so we can let you all get along with your day.
Don't you just love when he's so strong? I know I do. Anyways, I do want to thank Connor for being on once again. Another fantastic episode. Eric is 100% right when we spoke about the idea of narratives, the narratives we tell ourselves. Like, well, is there a historical context for them? Like, where do they originate from? Or are there something, that just came out of thin air? Oh, I decided suddenly, like, squats are bad for your knees. I think that understanding always the historical context can give a greater solidification to some of these conversations, because I've encountered that before, Eric, where it's bad because it's bad. Like, it's because it is. It's like, where does that even come from? Like, this belief you have, like, it's
called a conventional deadlift, Omar. It's the convention. Don't question it.
Yeah, Eric, conventional deadlift, 1908. Like, since 19, I like where you could say like a city founded in whatever, like 2300 BC. It's like, wow, there's that historical legacy. It's like the conventional deadlift performed since 1923. I'm like, oh, okay, like it's less than 100 years old that people have been doing it on a regular basis. But I digress. Eric said wrap it up. Let's wrap it up. You go ahead and leave a rating and review. It's wild. Like I had to fetch that one out from antiquity, basically, from the Library of Alexandria, really, to get that review. That was a 1-star. But you can go ahead and leave a rating review. It doesn't matter. International, because we had that Norwegian review we read. We even found out some Kiwis, Eric, left some reviews. So go ahead, leave a rating review on YouTube. Leave a comment. There's some fantastic ones. I know I do chuckle at. So go ahead. We'll do our best to interact. We're back every single Monday. And don't forget, we'll also link in the description what Eric was talking about, that other podcast, to get more information. We'll catch you in that next episode every single Monday.